Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Dark and Precious Storytime. I'm Dark.
And I'm Precious.
In this podcast, we flex our creative muscles and maybe your patience by narrating original stories complete with totally professional sound effects. This will be the best 30 minutes of your life you'll never get back. Today's episode is called The Battle, where an unlikely hero confronts a supernatural evil threatening to eradicate a small town. I used to live in a tiny town called Batesville on the outskirts of New Orleans. The town was populated by runoffs from the city, quirky, spiritually minded people who didn't want to deal with the large crowds of drunken revelers, ruinous erosion, heavy traffic, or any of the other downsides to living in a large metropolitan area built in a swamp. I rented a walkout basement apartment in a quaint house owned by Violetta Carrillo, a widower who had practiced Santeria and lived in Batesville most of her life. I'd lived in the basement apartment for years, so she'd all but adopted me, and I often referred to her as mi abuela, or grandmother. Although she'd never had children of her own, she considered the townspeople her extended family, often providing Santerian blessings and healings. I'd never fully understood her religion, but it seemed to revolve around white magic, and I'd seen enough over the years to realize Mrs. Carrillo had a certain magic of her own. I was working as a clerk in the local hardware store, so I was in the unique position of hearing all the town gossip, which is why I was one of the first to notice the effects on our town when a man known only as Mr. Peck bought the old Creighton Castle. Creighton Castle was a massive Victorian mansion owned by the wealthiest family in the area 50 years ago, until some tragedy happened and the home was abandoned. Ever since then, several individuals and businesses had tried to buy the property, but somehow the deals always fell through and the house stayed vacant. Naturally, it weathered and began to rot, taking on a distinctive sunken look, as if it were about to collapse. It had been partially reclaimed by thick thorn bushes and crawling vines of dead-looking ivy. Peck had bought the old Creighton Castle over the internet, sight unseen, and moved in amid a flurry of rumors. A week after he'd moved into the old house, there had still been no sign of moving trucks or deliveries, so everyone wondered how the man was living in the place without any running water, electricity, or even windows. A few had noticed a tiny light in one of the upstairs windows, as if from a burning candle, but that was it. When Peck had arrived, Mrs. Carrillo had suddenly withdrawn to her room, where she stayed for 7 days. I would leave trays of food and drink outside her door, but she would rarely touch it. When she emerged from her room, she slid a necklace with a small aromatic pouch over my head and clasped both of my hands, chanting something in Spanish. I was amused at first, but then I felt a slight tingling that started at the top of my head and eventually enveloped my whole body. Her chanting increased and the electric feeling intensified for a moment, and then disappeared as she stopped. "There is danger, mijo. Very great danger." I tried to pull away from her, but her grip was amazingly strong. "Promise me, mijo. Promise me to always wear this." She poked at the pouch dangling at my throat. At the time, I assured her I would wear it, but only to appease her. A few days later, at dusk, I looked out the large plate glass window at the hardware store to see an average-looking but well-dressed man talking to our resident homeless guy, Terry. Terry hung out on the bench in front of the store, talking to whoever would give him their ear. We let him stay because he never caused trouble or asked for money. He would just sit there next to his red duffel bag, occasionally sipping from a bottle in a paper bag. Tonight, however, Terry was staring raptly at the stranger's face. Since I knew everyone in town, I assumed the man was the mysterious Mr. Peck. After a couple of minutes, Terry abruptly stood up and walked away, leaving his bottle and bag on the bench as he strode purposefully out of sight.
I have a purpose.
I was surprised at his behavior, since I'd never seen Terry be purposeful about anything. So when I heard the bell over the door ding,
Ding!
I opened my mouth to ask the stranger what he had said to light a fire under Terry. but the words died in my throat. I mentioned the man was average-looking, but once I saw his face, all I could focus on were his eyes. The corneas were so white they were almost blue, and the irises had a definite reddish tint. They were like powerful magnets holding my gaze, and I couldn't look away. The man didn't look around or wander, but stared straight at me and strode over to the counter. I felt like a rabbit being approached by a wolf, so I instinctively recoiled and stepped back as he approached.
Yeah.
He either didn't notice or ignored my reaction and placed both hands on the counter. "You are able to make keys, yes?" It was hard to place his faint accent, but he was definitely foreign. I stammered a bit before responding. Yes?" I tilted my head toward the key-making machine behind me, then looked at the floor for a moment to muster my courage to look at his face again. Suddenly I heard a loud hissing noise, and looked up to see him with his head tilted slightly back, eyes closed, inhaling deeply through a nose wrinkled up in distaste.
Bleh.
He stopped inhaling and paused, like he was tasting the air. Then he opened his eyes and stared at my neck where Mrs. Carrillo's pendant hung under my shirt. "Interesting," he murmured, and then looked at my face as if seeing me for the first time. His look was one of curiosity, and it seemed some anger. "And you are able to change locks, yes?" he asked, more briskly than before. I cleared my throat and steadied myself before answering. Yes. Well, I don't personally, but I can call someone to do it for you." His gaze was steady but unnerving, since I hadn't seen him blink yet. "Yes, I would have you do that. You are to come to this address at this date and time." He produced a slip of paper with the Creighton Castle address and Monday, 8 p.m. printed on it in tiny, precise letters. He slid the paper toward me, then retracted his hand to its former place on the edge of the counter. I didn't want to touch the paper, so I just nodded and said, "I can do that, Mr." I left it hanging, so he'd fill the blank space. "Peck. You will call me Mr. Peck." I looked down at the floor again, away from those penetrating eyes. "Yes, sir, Mr. Peck. I will schedule a locksmith to come to your house on Monday." I turned to ring up the service on the cash register and heard the bell tinkle as the door opened.
Tingling.
I glanced over at it to see Peck walking away into the darkness. I hadn't even seen him move. Even worse, I hadn't even seen him pay for anything. I shuddered and wrote up the invoice. I'd let Kenny, the locksmith, deal with it. The next day, Terry didn't show up to sit on his bench. Unusual, but not surprising. But then he wasn't there the next day, or the next week. In fact, we never saw Terry in front of the hardware store again. I did see him one more time, but I'll tell you about that later. I did, however, talk to Kenny the locksmith the day after he'd changed the locks at the Peck place. Kenny was one of those cheerful people who talked with his hands, but when he came in at dusk to turn in his invoices, he was uncharacteristically quiet and elusive about it. I was dying to know what the house had looked like, what the Peck guy had said, etc. But Kenny just kept saying the guy was weird, and he couldn't really remember anything else except that Peck had given him $100 and told him to keep the change. Kenny kept rubbing his neck and looked really nervous, so I asked him if anything was wrong. He didn't make eye contact with me, but just mumbled something that sounded like, "I'm really hungry," and left the store, presumably to get some dinner. I never saw Kenny again. The next week, the young Methodist minister and his wife abruptly left town in the middle of the night, abandoning their house and most of their belongings. Soon after that, our sheriff suddenly claimed he was retiring, although he still had 2 years left in his term, packed up his pickup and drove away. Then the mayor herself, Glenda Hillbridge, announced she had to leave town to care for her sick sister in Florida and left that day, simply driving out of town without any luggage whatsoever. I kept telling myself not to be foolish, but it was hard to ignore the sudden departures of many of our town leaders. That people had begun clearing the streets earlier than usual, and that the town was, for all intents and purposes, shut down as the last of the orange light faded from the western sky. Social events at the schools and churches were canceled. My boss, Alan, owner of the hardware store, decided we needed to close before dark, so we started locking up every day at 5 p.m. I knew it all had something to do with Peck, but I couldn't figure out how. One by one, all of my friends and acquaintances left. Even the old die-hard geezers who gathered in the back of the store to play chess stopped showing up. Something was dreadfully wrong, and everyone was scared, including me. I was contemplating whether I should grab Mrs. Carrillo and leave town when Dan and Adam walked in. Dan was an older guy who lived on the outskirts of town with his son, Adam. There had been rumors years ago about Dan's arrival and how nobody had even known he had a grown son, much less one that was so enormous and strange-looking. People had reported weird noises and lights coming from Dan's cabin over the course of the next few months. Then suddenly, his son Adam began accompanying him into town. Though quiet and withdrawn, Dan was nice enough when engaged in conversation, and little by little over the years I had learned he'd been a scientist at one point, but moved here to take care of his boy Adam. Most people, myself included, smirked at the thought of Adam being referred to as a boy. You see, Adam was enormous, standing at about 6'8". He always wore a tattered blue hoodie with the hood pulled up, but I'd glimpsed scars crisscrossing his face. Whenever I'd asked him questions, he only looked at me and grunted. Despite his size, his proportions looked off. His arms were huge with muscle, but shorter than his torso, with the fingers barely reaching the waist. His legs, however, seemed longer than normal, which contributed to his height. Even his eyes were odd, with one being a bright blue and the other a dull hazel color. And strong. Whew! I'd watched him heave a 55-gallon drum of gasoline weighing almost 500 pounds off the ground and into the bed of Dan's truck. And Adam didn't seem to feel pain either. Once, Dan had accidentally bumped a screwdriver display, which started to topple over on top of him. Adam simultaneously pulled Dan out of the way and stuck an arm out to stop the display from falling. And I saw with horror that there was a screwdriver sticking through Adam's forearm. He didn't seem to notice until Dan said something. Then he simply pulled it out and threw it back on the display. I apologized profusely, but Dan and Adam seemed unperturbed and told me not to worry about it. They even bought the screwdriver that was covered with Adam's blood.
Ugh.
I'd always felt a sense of pity for the large man, who seemed to be a child caught in a giant's body. And after the screwdriver incident, I felt a little guilty, too. Adam had always lingered at our small toy section, gazing in fascination at the little toy tractors, stuffed animals, and what I call stocking stuffer toys like yo-yos, spinning tops, and rubber balls. He looked at them as if seeing them for the first time. So the next time they came in, I'd slid one of the toy tractors across the counter for Adam. His face had lit up, and he smiled through a mouthful of overly large teeth. He swept up the toy, clutching it to his chest, and he grunted softly. Now, whenever they were in the store, Adam would stand by the toy section and peek shyly at me. If I had a toy, I'd put it on the counter, and he'd lope over to grab it. Tonight, though, I was pretty distracted by current circumstances, and obviously more anxious than I realized, because when Dan casually asked where everyone was while I was ringing up his purchases, I just unloaded on the guy. I must have babbled for 5 minutes about how the minister, the mayor, the sheriff, and all the other people had left town suddenly. I had talked about Terry and Kenny and everyone who had just disappeared or left, and how the town felt like it was dying. As I rambled, Dan's demeanor changed from one of friendly detachment to a focused intensity. He placed his hands on the counter like Peck had done, and stared at me, eyes blazing. Adam felt the change in his father and shuffled over to stand next to him. I realized I probably sounded crazy, so I trailed off and finished by telling Dan what he owed for the purchases, the button on my register ringing as punctuation.
Ding!
Dan ignored my request. "How long has this been happening?" he demanded. I counted back to when Peck had arrived. About 5 months, I responded. His intensity reminded me of Peck, but didn't feel as dangerous. He leaned forward and asked, slowly but clearly, "Who is new?" I didn't understand the question, so I just looked at him quizzically. He rapped his knuckles on the countertop in frustration,
Rap.
which startled me. "Who is new? All these people leaving. Has anyone new shown up?" "Peck," I answered immediately. His eyebrows raised in curiosity and then began to knit back into furrows of concentration as I told him about my one interaction with the enigmatic stranger. "And Mr. Peck arrived," he prompted me. "About 5 months ago," I finished quietly. After my outburst and Dan's reaction, I felt guilty. Deep down, I'd known something bad was happening. I'd known it had something to do with Peck, yet I hadn't warned anyone or even talked about it until now. If something bad had happened to those people, it was on me because I hadn't said anything. My face flushed. I looked down and swallowed a few times to keep from tearing up. I felt Dan pat my shoulder. "Don't feel bad, son. There's nothing you could have done." I looked back up at him and was surprised to see his posture and demeanor had changed. Before, he'd been a little stooped and unremarkable. Now, however, his back was ramrod straight, and I realized he was actually pretty tall himself. Squeezing my shoulder, he leaned in and said, "It is no longer safe here. You should collect Violetta and leave as soon as possible." He stared for a moment out the window where darkness was swallowing the remaining lavender swatches of sky in the west. On second thought, wait until daybreak. Nighttime is no longer safe. He abruptly turned and walked to the door, and then turned back and marched to the counter. "And give me all of your double-aught buckshot." I scrambled and grabbed several boxes of shotgun ammunition and slid them across the counter to him. "What's going on, Dan? What do you know?" He paused, scooping the boxes into his pockets and sighed, staring at the floor. "It's happening again, but this time we'll stop him for good." With that, he jogged out the door and to the truck where Adam was waiting. I stared in confusion as they sped away, and then I swore as I realized they hadn't paid for the ammo.
Mother puss bucket.
I closed up the store and hurried home. The only outside entrance to my basement apartment was a sliding glass door off a small patio. Once inside, I locked the door and pulled the vertical blinds closed. The darkness of the night felt almost alive, pressing in at the glass ominously. Dan's warning echoed in my head, and I was afraid. I thought about going upstairs to hang out with Mrs. Carrillo, but I didn't want to frighten her too, so I tried to ignore it and just focused on watching a TV show. At some point I dozed off, but then awoke to the sound of a persistent tapping on the glass door.
Tap, tap, tap.
Thinking that maybe Mrs. Carrillo had gotten locked out. That had happened a couple of times before. I walked over and pulled the blinds aside, and then gasped in surprise as I saw Terry standing on the patio, hands pressed against the glass. "Terry?" I was relieved he was still alive, but incredulous that he would show up at my place. I put my hand on the locking mechanism to unlock the door, but stopped and looked back up at Terry. He put one of his hands on the outside handle of the door as if he were getting ready to yank it open. His eyes were still fixed on me, and it took me a moment to identify what was different about him. Although he looked pretty much identical to the man I'd last seen on the bench in front of the store, he seemed more pale and hungry, and now I could see his clothes looked more dirty and soiled than usual, with dirt caked in the wrinkles of his hands, as if he'd been digging. His body was hunched forward as if he were getting ready to lunge. I straightened and looked at him again. "Terry, what's going on? Where have you been?" I called through the glass. He just shifted and glanced back at the handle where his hand rested. "Let me in so I can tell you about it." His voice was off too, much rougher and huskier than before. His eyes bored into mine. I could see his features shift a little, as if he were trying to pass me some nonverbal message with his face. His eyebrows raised a bit, and his eyes narrowed, and he tilted his head toward the door handle again. "Open it, boy." His whole demeanor was off-putting, and I didn't like being called boy. So I just said, "Terry, I'm happy to see you again, but I'm not letting you in. I can call some for... And his hand slammed against the glass and he screamed at me.
Slam.
Open this goddamn door. Open it now. I command you to open it and let me in.
I barked a short cry of surprise
Woof.
and stepped back. The glass door rattled in its frame as he yanked on the handle.
Let me in. Let me in.
He was getting more and more agitated, and I was worried he was going to break something. So I grabbed my phone to call what remained of our police department and picked up a frying pan from the dish drainer. But before I could dial 911, I heard a distant booming sound.
Boom.
And then another.
Boom.
Terry jerked his head in that direction, uttered a growl of frustration, and sprinted toward the back of the property. Although the gloom quickly enveloped him, I could have sworn he just jumped over the 6-foot privacy fence instead of scaling it. I stood there gaping for a moment, then jumped at a noise on the stairs leading up to Mrs. Carrillo's kitchen. I whirled and thrust the frying pan out in front of me. Mrs. Carrillo descended the stairs, ignoring my menacing cookware, and marched over to stand in front of the glass door where Terry had been. "They visited you," she said as a statement, not a question. "It was just Terry," I responded, standing next to her. I thought of his behavior and the unnatural athleticism. "I think," I added. "Terry is no longer with us," she said simply. "You were right not to let him in. The weak ones can only enter if invited." "Weak ones? What weak ones?" She flapped a hand at me dismissively. "Lower demons, vampires, whatever you call them. I protect you and the house against them. But as their numbers grow, so does their power. They will be back. Next time, more than one. Next time, the leader will come." She whisked the blinds shut, reached into her pouch, and sprinkled something on the floor in front of the door. "Wait, did you say vampire?" I asked incredulously. "Like in the movies?" "Not like in the movies." She turned and waved a finger in my face. "Forget about the movies. They are lies." I followed her upstairs, peppering her with questions. "Are they allergic to sunlight?" I asked. "No." "Garlic?" "No." She was stopping and sprinkling dust from her pouch onto the ledge of each window. "Holy water?" "Not really." "A stake through the heart?" "Well, yes." "Seriously? Well, that's cool." She smacked the back of my head.
Swap.
"Anyone is allergic to having a wooden stake stuck in their heart, pendejo." "Well, then how do we fight them?" The fear must have come out in my voice because she turned and looked at me gently and hugged me. "Do not worry, mijo. This evil spreads in the night, but I am strong in my beliefs. You have a good heart, and we have powerful friends who will fight with us." "Powerful friends? Who? Everyone has left town." Mrs. Carrillo patted my cheek and said, "You will see. Now ready yourself. They are coming." Off in the distance, I could hear more of those faint booming sounds.
Boom. Boom.
But they seemed to be getting closer. "What is that noise?" I asked rhetorically. "The fight has begun. He is doing his part." She turned and faced the large oaken front door, hands clasped in front of her. I stood next to her, unsure what to do. "What fight? Who are you talking about?" She just stood there without answering. I sighed in exasperation and looked around for a weapon until I realized I was still holding my frying pan, which I figured was about as good as I was going to get. I pulled a chair out from the dining table and sat down. I was worried. I was a little scared. But most of all, I was bored. I decided to go down to my apartment and maybe watch TV or something when I heard gibbering voices outside on the porch, accompanied by light scratching and tapping noises on the windows.
Tap.
The furtive sounds creeped me out,
Ugh.
and I was glad all the curtains had been drawn closed. All at once, the lights went out, and I gasped. Mrs. Carrillo had lit a few candles earlier, so it wasn't pitch black, but the room was now filled with sinister shadows that moved in the flickering light of the candles. I jumped at a crisp rapping on the door.
Rap, 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 rap.
5 sharp knocks echoed through the house, and I inched in front of Mrs. Carrillo, holding my frying pan up defensively. "Be easy, mijo," Mrs. Carrillo said in a low voice. "They cannot enter." The latch on the door clicked, and it swung open slowly on unoiled hinges, the sound raising goosebumps on my skin. There was a dark figure outlined in the doorway, and despite the darkness on the porch, I had no trouble seeing the brightly luminescent eyes of Mr. Peck. He stood there with his hands clasped in front of him. There was a bright half-moon out, which cast eerie shadows on the front lawn. I glimpsed figures frolicking across the grass, but didn't dare take my eyes off of Peck. "Hello, Violetta. I've heard so much about you." I could hear the smirk in his voice. "And the boy from the hardware store. I should have known." He chuckled deep in his throat. "Why don't you let me in so we can put this business behind us?" I looked past him at the cavorting shapes and then back at his face. Somehow his eyes had gotten even bigger, widening until it seemed like they took up half his face. I stared in fascination until Mrs. Carrillo smacked me in the head again.
Twat.
I saw it actually taken a few steps toward Peck, and I scrambled back again. He groaned in irritation. "Very well. We'll do this the hard way then." And he stepped across the threshold. I felt Mrs. Carrillo jump in surprise, and her reaction made my blood run cold. We both started to back up. "I thought you said they couldn't enter," I whispered frantically. She started praying in Spanish and tossed a handful of powder on the floor in front of her. Peck stopped, his features contorted in a grimace. "I will say you're not making it easy, woman." For the first time I noticed he was moving like he was in pain, and I could even see small wisps of smoke coming from his skin. Carrillo continued chanting in Spanish, her eyes locked on his. I stepped in front of her again, holding my frying pan in front of me. I was shaking so hard it felt like I was vibrating, but I felt the least I could do would be to slow him down so she could get away. By now he was about 5 feet away and still walking slowly towards us. I noticed with horror that there were now several figures silently gathered around the doorway, staring in at me hungrily. I recognized several of the faces: the sheriff, the mayor, even my old friend Terry, basically all of the people who'd left town. Now it was obvious they had been recruited into Peck's harem of evil, but apparently they weren't powerful enough to cross through the magical protective barrier, so they just huddled together like vultures waiting for death. Suddenly the frying pan was yanked from my grip and I was flying through the air. I slammed into the picture window hard enough to shatter it.
Psh.
Luckily the curtains were drawn, so they saved me from being sliced to ribbons. Nevertheless, the impact knocked all the air from my lungs, and I landed on the porch in a heap of heavy fabric and shards of glass. Wait. On the porch? I was outside the house and its protection. In a panic, I clawed at the curtains wrapped around my body while heaving for air. I felt the thumping of footsteps on the wooden porch
Thump, thump.
as the vultures sprinted eagerly towards me. Terry was the first to reach me, of course. He dove on top of me, and I managed to get my arm across his neck before he tore my throat out. I gagged at the rotten stench of his breath, and my arm started to give way before his frenzied lunging toward my face. But suddenly he was gone, as if he'd never been there. An enormous shape materialized over me, and I could make out a tattered hoodie. "Adam?" I whispered, just as the remaining vampires reached him. Although I only caught brief images in the dim light of the moon and candles, I could see Adam swatting the creatures around like gnats. They seemed to be faster than him, but he was impervious to their bites and scratches, and once he latched onto one with his huge hands, he would simply rip them apart. A misty spray began to rain down on me as I strained and pulled at the curtain. Since it looked like Adam had it under control and I was getting dangerously close to puking each time I thought of what was dripping on me, I stopped trying to get out of my cocoon and just pulled it over my head. After a few interminable minutes, the snarling and ghastly ripping sounds stopped, and I was lifted up and stood on my feet, the curtain falling around my ankles. Adam stood there silently. "Man, thanks, Adam. I'm really glad you came." He snorted a response,
Snort.
and then stepped into the living room where Peck had backed Mrs. Carrillo into the far corner. Peck's skin was still smoking, and I could see that his face was a mask of rage and pain. His voice was deeper and more guttural, and I was amazed to see his clothes rippling as he changed form. His arms and legs lengthened, and his head contorted into an elongated snout with razor-sharp teeth, topped with glowing red eyes set in a horned skull. Mrs. Carrillo had closed her eyes, but was still praying, dropping to her knees. The demon creature that had been Peck uttered a screech, and I realized it was laughing.
"You gods can't save you now, old woman. Tonight, you're mine. I repeat."
His deep, raspy voice was cut off as Adam caught him in a flying tackle, smashing the creature through the living room wall into the kitchen. Dishes, pans, and even the kitchen sink came flying out the new kitchen door, accompanied by a cacophony of bangs, screeches, and growls.
Bang. Screech.
Dodging a spinning coffee maker, I ran over to Mrs. Carrillo and grabbed her arm, yanking her to her feet. I pulled her to the front door, picking up another frying pan from the collection on the floor. I heard a long, low wail of pain, and then a triumphant shriek as the Peck creature burst out of the kitchen. It was ragged and bloody, and one of its arms had been ripped off, but it still moved shockingly fast, covering the distance to the front door in a heartbeat. Carrillo and I managed to stumble through the door and off the porch as the creature squeezed itself through the front doorway. I thought of how heroic Adam had been, sacrificing himself for us. I thought of poor Terry and the sheriff and all the other people who'd been victims of this demon, and I got mad, madder than I had ever been. So I did the only thing I could think of. I threw my frying pan. I threw it right at the creature with all my might, just as it pulled free of the doorway and stood to its full height. The pan landed squarely in the middle of its face, and it uttered a surprised "hunk" before crouching to leap at it. So much for the heroic ending, I thought. Then a figure strode out of the darkness next to us and said, "Cover your ears, folks." I was so surprised to see Dan carrying a shotgun that I only managed a bewildered "huh?" before he started firing at Peck. I clapped my hands over my ears, but they were already ringing from the loud blasts. Dan stalked toward the creature, shooting it over and over as it screamed in pain,
Ow.
and flopped around on the porch. It started scurrying away, but Dan dropped the shotgun, leaped onto the porch, and in one fluid movement drew a wicked-looking machete and started hacking at the creature's neck. After a few brutal blows, the demonic head rolled to a stop a few feet away from the twitching body. Dan punted the head out into the yard and then turned to walk back towards us, picking up his shotgun on the way. I saw his lips moving, and I thought he might be praying like Mrs. Carrillo was doing. But then I saw her lips moving and realized they were talking to each other. All I could hear was ringing. "Thank you, Dan," I said, though based on his startled reaction I must have yelled it at him. He helped Mrs. Carrillo up, and she leaned on him as he led her back to the house. I followed along, staying far away from the demon body. Each time I tried to tell Dan what happened, or thank him for his help, or tell him how sorry I was about Adam, Mrs. Carrillo just patted my arm and put a finger to her lips in a shushing gesture. I found it odd that Dan didn't even seem that concerned about Adam, until the huge man stumbled out of the kitchen holding the demon's arm in one hand, and his own foot in the other. I gaped as he limped gingerly on the stump where his foot had been, as if he'd only sprained an ankle. I tried to ask just what the hell that was all about, but I guess I was screaming my questions because Mrs. Carrillo shushed me again.
Shh.
Dan patted Mrs. Carrillo's cheek, lingering long enough that I could see something pass between the two of them. Then he led Adam out of the house. Just before they disappeared into the darkness, Adam turned and waved at me with the hand that was still holding the demon's arm, which made it look like the demon was waving. I shuddered and went back inside. In the following days, Mrs. Carrillo and I packed up a few belongings and drove away to stay with her sister in New Orleans. It took a while for my hearing to return to normal, but even then Mrs. Carrillo was reluctant to talk about what had happened. We'd still hear rumors about Batesville, how there are strange creatures and disappearances and haunted houses. There's even a rumor about a giant that stalks through the town, accompanied by a maniac with a shotgun. Remembering the fear and helplessness I'd felt that night, I've decided to return to Batesville. Even though the master vampire had been destroyed, some of the lesser ones remain and have to be stopped before they spread to surrounding communities or, God forbid, New Orleans. But I know a couple of guys who can keep that from happening and in the process can probably teach me how to stand up against evil. I figure that as effective as they were at fighting the terrors of the night, there has to be some way I can lend them a hand. Or a foot. The end.
The end.
Okay, so this is episode number 6, right?
Our Halloween episode.
Halloween episode.
Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween, yes. So what is your favorite part of Halloween?
My favorite part of Halloween. Carving pumpkins and eating pumpkin seeds. Okay, sort of. I mean, that used to be my favorite, but my very favorite, I just found out, and you know what I'm going to say, is scaring people in haunted houses. Oh my God.
Oh, that's right. Yes. So recently we had the privilege of donning like full body, what do they call them? Morph suits?
Morph suits, yes.
Mine was black and yours was like a splotchy gray with, looked like cobwebs. You look like a little mass of cobwebs.
Well, there were spiders and stuff on it.
Right, that's why you look like cobwebs.
Okay.
And so we did it was actually a haunted battleship. And so we would hide like around a corner and people would come walking through and we would just step out and scare people.
Make creepy movements
Yeah.
and scare people.
Yeah, you would make the creepy movements. I would just kind of dart around and people were always like, hey, I just saw something. But I wasn't like terribly convincing as a spirit. Because I'd be like, I'd dart around a corner and then you hear me go, bong, as I like ricocheted off or something. And I'd be like, ah, shit, that hurt.
But I actually got to scare people.
You did.
And then when they walked away, I would giggle because it made me happy. It brought me joy.
Yeah, it's a little terrifying, actually. Yeah, you enjoyed it, I think, so much that it was actually a little bit disturbing.
If we lived closer, I would have volunteered again because that was awesome.
Yeah, I don't know what it says about you as a person, though. But
Hey, people were coming there for the purpose of getting scared. I was providing a service. You're welcome.
you're just doing your duty.
That's right.
Wow, okay. Well, hello, Miss Rational. Or I should say, hello, Miss Rationalization.
It's Mrs. now.
Mrs. Yeah, well. So, yeah, so your favorite part of Halloween now is dressing up and scaring people. Does that mean that you'd want to buy a morph suit and like hang out on the front porch and wait for like the little kids to show up and then you'd do that whole thing and scare the shit out of them?
I don't like to scare little kids. It's just teenagers and adults.
Teenagers and adults have it coming. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Hey, they're there by choice.
Right.
Small children are kind of like, okay, we'll go to a haunted house. Ah! And that's like their whole experience is them screaming and covering their eyes and crying.
Well, I would think you would just eat that up.
Well, no. 'Cause they're
Scarring them for
children.
life. Oh, okay.
I don't want to scar children for life, just teenagers
Just
and
teenagers
adults.
and adults. Okay. Well, I guess my favorite part of Halloween.
Yes, Dark, what is your favorite part of Halloween?
Well, it used to be eating all the leftover candy. And I can tell you what it wasn't, though. It wasn't giving out the candy to trick-or-treaters at Halloween.
Oh yeah, you're a little stingy with the candy.
Yeah, I tried that for a couple of years. Like, I would like give them out like one or two pieces to all the kids. But then they'd be like, "Hey, can I have more?" And I'd be like, "No, get off my porch." And then they fired me from candy giving duty. So
I didn't know it was an actual job.
I didn't know you can get fired from it. That's for sure. But I managed. So I got fired from that, and then. But I would say, I guess Halloween. I don't know. I like to watch the occasional scary movie, but I'm kind of a big pansy, so I don't like to be scared. Kind of like you, I like to scare people.
But you don't like to be scared.
I don't like
I get
to be
that.
scared. Yeah.
I can relate.
But anyway, so yeah, I think with Halloween in another week
Yes.
ish.
Well, depending on when you post this, but from when we're recording this, it's in another week, yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for clarifying that.
In an annoying way.
Oh my God.
Do you think maybe our listeners are have had enough of our witty banter?
You can never have too much witty banter.
Because we're delightful.
We're just going to keep telling people that until they come on board.
Right.
All right. Well, I guess we're going to go ahead and end with that. This is our special holiday edition. Really, the only thing special about it is it's coming out right before Halloween. So, for our faithful listeners out there, we appreciate you tuning in, and hope you have or turning in. Yeah. So, for our faithful listeners out there, we appreciate you tuning in, and hope you have a great spooky Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
We hope you enjoyed listening to our story as much as we enjoyed telling it. We're pretty sure you have more friends than we do, so be sure to tell them all about us and click to follow our podcast. You can also follow us on Instagram at dark.n.precious or follow us on Facebook at Dark&Precious Storytime. Feel free to leave us any feedback or if you have any story suggestions. Who knows? You might just hear your story idea come to life in the next episode of Dark&Precious Storytime. I'm Dark.
And I'm Precious.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.